Welcome back, everybody, to LSC 700. And I apologize for having to miss last week. And Brett, I don't think is on, but thank you to him for filling in. But unfortunately, I had an Academies Committee meeting all day. Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce one of our own again, Sedona Chinn, who joined us last year, a year ago now, almost exactly, as an assistant professor from the University of Michigan. I think every time I've introduced her or in some public setting, I try to make a Michigan joke at her expense, and that has bombed every single time, so I'm not doing it this time. But she is doing work in broadly construed misinformation, uncertainties of science, political dynamics surrounding science. Some of you are working with her already on content analytic work. Some of her work is also experimental, and she's just developing a course, or teaching for the first time a course that she's developed for us on identifying, diagnosing, and countering misinformation, which obviously is a topic that at the moment is probably at the forefront of everyone's thinking in this field. So with that, Sedona, thank you so much for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Dietram. Okay, I'm going to share my screen now because I have some slides. But yeah, I generally just wanted to say hello. And even though I've been here now in Madison almost 9 months, I haven't had the chance to meet very many of you. So I'm very excited to be here and be able to share what I'm working on and things I've been doing over the past year with you all through this virtual format. My name is Sedona Chinn. I'm a professor here in the department, and like Dietram said, the majority of my work concerns when and why people distrust and dismiss scientific information. And so a lot of my work has recently been looking at scientific uncertainties and scientific disagreements in media and how people respond to those. Some of the work, like I'm going to present today, concerns politicization and political polarization around science issues, as well as more recent work has gotten into social media and the kind of both benefits and pitfalls of communicating science on social media. So one of the things that I really enjoy in my research is doing some content analytic work, particularly computer-assisted content analytic work, in ways that really help to address gaps in our field's knowledge, as well as to address theoretically informed questions, going beyond just kind of some descriptive analysis and really using these tools in ways that address limitations in our current knowledge. So I'm going to present two studies today that were both published in the past year that use these tools to look at politicization and polarization in science news. And the first study, I'm going to talk about climate change news, about how we can leverage these tools to look at overtime trends and quantitatively measure the degree of politicization and polarization in news coverage over a 30-year period. And then in the second study, we apply some of the same techniques to look at the initial coverage in the US of COVID-19. So this is where we're really looking at novel issues and can leverage these kinds of tools to study politicization and polarization when we're not yet sure what the emergent themes are, polarizing frames, and these kinds of things. So we know politicization and polarization have effects on science attitudes. It's very well documented in our field that when people encounter a politicizing cue around science, they're more likely to rely on their partisan identities. And when those cues are particularly polarized, that can reduce the impact of other substantive information, and it can make people more certain in their less substantiated beliefs. But two areas, like I pointed out in the last slide, where these features of news coverage haven't been as well documented, because there has been a lot of work on politicization cues in science news, particularly in climate change news. But we haven't yet come up with ways of really measuring quantitatively how these trends change over time, how these features in news coverage how they have changed over time, and how that might influence public opinion. And like I said before, these can be really helpful also for looking at novel issues when we're not really sure how we conceptualize or operationalize the polarizing frames or themes in coverage when it's a novel or emergent issue. So I'm going to start by talking about my work on politicization and polarization across a little over 30 years of climate change newspaper content. we know we have a great amount of evidence that there's been over time changes in elite public opinion as well as just lay people public opinion. And we also have a great amount of evidence from past literature that's looked at politicization and polarization cues in news, particularly in climate change news. But the struggle with stringing together these studies to look at kind of a trend over time and to look at whether, or to answer the question of whether climate change news has become more or less politicized or polarized over time, is that past work has often employed different conceptualization of what politicization means. Sometimes they're referring to balanced coverage, that is giving space for scientists to speak and contrarians to speak. Sometimes it's about kind of the polarizing frames or the way journalists talk about different conflict frames between different political parties, or the way that journalists might prioritize certain responses to climate change over other responses can polarize the issue in different ways. Other studies have talked about uncertainties and the role that uncertainty plays in politicizing news coverage. But basically, we're working with a lot of evidence that there is politicization and polarization in climate change news coverage across this 30-year period. But it's difficult based on the existing evidence, given these different conceptualizations, operationalizations, also studies working in different time periods from 6 months to maybe at most 8 years, and different media from TV to newspapers to really make any claims about whether climate change news coverage has become more polarized, less polarized, consistently polarized, etc. And so the point of this study was really to give us that measure of politicization and polarization in climate change news coverage over time, which might help us understand why we see increasing trends in public opinion polarization over time. In order to do this, we collected a really, really large data set of newspapers. And we did this via LexisNexis, but using this web services kit that allowed us to download way more articles than you normally can through LexisNexis. And the following analyses, which were focused on newspapers we have over from the 80s to present, to the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, and the Chicago Tribune, yielded approximately 40,000 climate change newspaper articles that these analyses that I'm going to present in a minute are based off of. But I want to point out that the trends that we see in these 4 newspapers replicate across the entire set. It's just that we didn't have, or LexisNexis didn't have, data for all of those newspapers going back to the 80s. You see some of them start up in the 90s. If we're going to be looking at politicization in 40,000 newspaper articles, we need to employ a different approach than human coding, because that's just going to take far too long unless we sample. But we wanted to use that whole population. And so what we did was, when it came to measuring politicization, we used a dictionary keyword approach, which essentially takes these keywords for Republicans, Democrats, and scientists and counts the mentions of these keywords in newspaper articles. And we chose to focus on these actors, on these partisan actors, because they're central to most conceptualizations of politicization. And they kind of play into journalistic norms of when you're first introducing people in newspaper articles. They say Republican senator, et cetera, Democratic congressman, and the person's name. So we didn't capture people's names over this time period, but using these keywords, we were able to capture mentions of Democrats, Republicans, and scientists. And I can talk a little bit more about how this particular measure might be underestimating the prevalence of politicization and the prevalence of these actors in news stories, but I'll talk about that a little later or in the Q&A. When we look at the trends in political and scientific actors over time across different issues, we did this as a little validity check just to make sure that we were going to be captured, that this was a measure of politicization that indicated politicization, more politicized issues. That is, global warming and fracking, which are more politicized issues in the US context, did indeed see higher mentions of politicians in comparison to scientists, in comparison to issues like hurricanes and recycling, which are in general less politicized. And if we look closely at the top left here, at mentions of political actors in global warming coverage over this 30-year period, what we can see is that in kind of the 80s and 90s, we were seeing scientists outnumber mentions of politicians in climate change coverage. But around the 2000s, and particularly in the 2010s, we start to see politicians outnumber scientists in mentions in climate change newspaper coverage. And to us, that indicated that global warming news coverage was becoming more politicized over time. When we look at this and break it down by Republicans and Democrats, we see kind of a similar linear trend for both, but particularly that jump in around the 2010s seems to be driven by more Republican actors being mentioned in science, in global warming news coverage, which is something that's interesting. So in sum, this is a pretty quick and maybe blunt way of measuring politicization that showed that climate change news coverage has become increasingly politicized between 1985 and 2017, particularly that in the 80s and 90s, we saw more mentions of scientists, and since the 2000s and 2010s, the politicians begin to outnumber mentions of scientists. So we can infer that this coverage has become increasingly politicized, but this doesn't actually give us any leverage on the nature of that politicization. For instance, an issue could be increasingly politicized because there is increasing bipartisan cooperation to address this issue. We can guess that that's not what is happening based on the US context, but our measure of politicization doesn't actually give us any information about the nature of that politicization, about what the conflicts or cooperation is. So what we needed to do also was to measure polarization. That is, the extent to which Republicans and Democrats were holding different positions over time. And in particular, this is slightly more difficult than measuring politicization. We can't just count words in this to measure this. What we really wanted was a measure of the degree of difference in the language that surrounded Republicans and the language surrounding Democrats over time. That is, both the quotes that Republicans and Democrats were quoted as saying, but also the ways in which journalists contextualize these mentions. If the language is quite similar, that would indicate a low degree of polarization. But if the language that journalists were using to contextualize partisans was very different, then that would indicate more polarization. And we needed some measure of that, and some measure of that we could look at over time. So we aimed to adopt a little bit more statistically ambitious approach than just counting words or using some sort of word frequencies. What we did was use a word scaling technique, which I'll walk you through here. What we did was we collected the 100 words that surrounded mentions of Democrats or Republicans in climate change news articles across our whole data set. I say Republicans or Democrats, not both. Then we used an unsupervised machine learning algorithm, one called WordFish, which uses word frequencies to identify a single dimension and to assign each paragraph a position along that dimension. Functionally, this dimension captures not all the ways in which climate change can be discussed, not all of the differences and all of the frames, but the most important or most common differences in language in these climate change Republican and Democrat paragraphs. And it uses these word frequencies to place each individual paragraph, and we had, I think, 130,000 of them, on this single dimension. Now, WordFish is an algorithm that's been used or was developed specifically to look at ideological positions and how political party manifestos have changed ideological position over time. And it's also been used to look at the extent of influence that lobbying groups have on the resulting policy. Functionally, what we did was we took the average for Republican and Democrat paragraph positions on this latent dimension by Congress and took the difference between Republican and Democratic paragraphs, the difference in these positions. if Republican and Democratic paragraphs, on average, were pretty close in their position on this latent dimension, that would indicate that the language that they used was quite similar. But if, on the other hand, Republican and Democratic paragraphs were quite far apart on average on the spectrum, that would indicate that the language and the words that they used were very, very different and would indicate more polarization. In sum, we were measuring with this machine learning algorithm how similar or different the language surrounding mentions of Democrats and Republicans were in climate change news articles over time. It's a complicated method that I'm happy to talk about more in the Q&A. When we look at the results, now the y-axis here, units-wise, it's not very intelligible or intuitive, but functionally, this is the difference between Republican and Democratic paragraph positions on average over time, higher differences being that there's greater difference in the language that's being used and to contextualize Republican and Democratic actors in climate change news. And what we see isn't the same as politicization. In politicization, we saw a pretty linear trend of increasing politicization. But what we see regarding polarization is that polarization was quite constant or consistent until about 2010, 2011. And since then has remained at a higher level fairly consistently. So what we took away from this study was that we were able to use these tools to show that politicization has increased over time to be a pretty common feature of climate change news coverage, which I think is unsurprising, but the degree to which politicization is common in coverage was quite surprising. We had, in the average climate change news article, political actors were mentioned over 2 times. And given that there were multiple climate change news articles per day by the end of the time frame in our data set, that's quite a lot of politicized coverage. But the polarization was quite level until about 2011, which was the same time we started to see Republicans outnumber Democrats. And that we don't go into why this 2010, 2011 might be this kind of watershed year for climate change news coverage. It does converge with current events around the emergence of the Tea Party movement, of Republicans getting primaried for talking about their belief in climate change and their support for climate action, as well as the ClimateGate scandal. So this study quantitatively demonstrates increasing politicization and polarization in climate change news coverage over time by using these computational text as data approaches. And these methods were reproducible across multiple issues, across a set of national and both regional newspapers, as well as whole articles and relevant paragraphs. So turning to COVID news, this was a different challenge because we weren't looking so much at over time trends. What we were looking at was an emergent issue that became quite immediately in the public eye polarized. That it really didn't take a long time before we started seeing divisions in public opinion between Republicans and Democrats about the severity of COVID-19, about how we should respond to COVID-19, and that these became quite fraught and increasingly hostile. So we had the question of why was this the case? And in this case, we drew on data from 6 journals, 6 newspapers from across the country. And we also looked at evening news broadcasts to look at politicization and polarization in the first months of COVID-19 news coverage, when we weren't exactly sure what the emerging themes were, what the politicizing themes, because we started doing this study in May. We took the date range of March 1st to May 26th. And the reason why we took that first 3 months was because before March 1st, we really weren't seeing a ton of articles in US press about COVID-19. It wasn't a large enough sample to get any sort of reliable results from. And then May 26th was about the time that George Floyd was killed and the media shifted focus towards other pressing issues. So in this data set, we stuck to stories that mentioned a COVID keyword that mentioned coronavirus 3 or more times, because basically every news article during this period was mentioning coronavirus at least once, but that doesn't mean that that's what the story was about. So we looked at newspaper coverage and evening nightly news broadcasts that mentioned coronavirus 3 or more times. That gave us about 7,000 news articles, which for reference was about 40% of all coverage in our data set. And we used similar dictionaries, but we also, because we were working in a narrower context and over a much shorter period of time, we did add some more specified keywords, some names, as well as a few other actors. And we employed the same word counting approach to measuring politicization in COVID news. And what we saw in newspaper coverage was that politicians were regularly, and from about the first week on in news coverage, in COVID news coverage, outnumbering mentions of scientists. Again, this is newspaper coverage, was immediately quite polarized in the US. Nightly news broadcasts, network news coverage was somewhat less polarized, which we were interested in, and we don't really have a good explanation as to why this might be the case. So I'm curious what your thoughts are. But in nightly news broadcasts and network news, scientists were often more dominant in coverage about COVID than politicians. So there was less politicized. When it comes to measuring polarization, again, we went through that same word scaling technique that I talked about previously. And again, the y-axes here are a little bit unintuitive or unintelligible, but again, they represent the difference in language between Republicans and Democrat mentions in COVID-19 news coverage. What's interesting about these features, about polarization in COVID news, is that we don't see an increasing trend over time. Instead, what we see is a consistent level of political polarization for both newspapers and network news across the first 3 months of COVID-19 news coverage. And because of this scaling technique, we can actually compare the difference here between COVID and our results of climate change. And what we find is that in the first 3 months of COVID-19 news coverage, this news coverage was as or more polarized than climate change news coverage, which is one of the most politically polarized issues in the US. And that's fascinating to me because that is the first information that people saw about COVID-19. And so it's unsurprising that that would shape their perceptions. But how is this polarized? We did a little bit more digging because this was a novel issue. We looked, after removing some of the names, we looked at, okay, well, what are the most distinguishing words in Democratic associated paragraphs and Republican associated paragraphs? And what we saw, whereas in climate change, the main differences seemed to be around that Republicans were distinguished by questions about whether the science is real behind climate change, whereas Democrats were associated with energy policy words. When it came to COVID news coverage, it really seemed to reflect a federal state conflict, that the Republican language paragraphs were distinguished by words related to the federal administration, also some words related to China and the ultimately unsuccessful treatment options of hydroxychloroquine, whereas Democratic mentions were much more about state level actors, primaries, how COVID was going to affect the Democratic primaries, and governors, particularly in California, New York, and Michigan. So the takeaways we had about COVID news was in the first 3 months of COVID news coverage in the US, there was a high degree of polarization in newspaper coverage, but somewhat less so in network news. However, in both outlets, when political actors were mentioned, the discourse was highly polarized. That polarization was immediate across the time period, and it stayed consistent with similar levels of polarization as climate change news coverage. And this was really interesting, especially because it was the first 3 months of coverage, and this was the first information that people got about COVID-19, and that may help explain why public opinion became so quickly divided. So in sum, both of these studies are pulling from well-known literatures about how politicization and polarization affect people's science attitudes. And these studies use text as data approaches to identify these cues or these signals in media to see how prevalent they were over time and among novel issues. And I'm happy to talk about some limitations of those and extensions of future work and take any of your questions. So thank you very much.